Hello and welcome to the second instalment of Watchtower in Focus, the series that takes a closer look at the world of Jehovah's Witnesses. In this episode, my guests and I will be discussing case study 54 of the Royal Commission in Australia, which held a public hearing on Friday, March the 10th, into Watchtower's response to grave concerns over institutional child abuse mishandling. Joining me to dissect what was said during the course of the hearing, all the way from the UK via the magic of Skype, is JW Survey's editor, Covert Fade. Hello, Covert.
Hello, Lloyd. It's good to be back.
Nice to have you with us again. Also joining us for this episode is JW Survey's US-based assistant editor, John Redwood.
Hello, everyone.
Hi there, John.
Good to see you all.
And finally, it wouldn't be a discussion about the Australian Royal Commission without a well-known and much-loved Australian guest who is joining us from down under. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the founder of JWFacts.com, Paul Grundy. Hello there, Paul.
Good morning.
Now, Paul, I count myself among many who have benefited from your amazing work on JWFacts.com, which is a wonderful resource for witnesses who are faced with the difficult task of scrutinising their beliefs. I'm sure Covert and John would say the same. And we've certainly picked a worthwhile subject to talk about for the first ever JW Survey, JW Facts video collaboration. Am I right in saying that you were actually present in the audience for case study 54 at the Royal Commission?
Yes, that's correct. I work right near where the court is, so I ducked down for a couple of hours during the session.
Fantastic. So we have with us, helping us dissect what happened, someone who was actually there. So I'm just going to take a few minutes before we get into kind of a point-by-point analysis, just to kind of pick your brains and ask you, what happened roughly. If you could summarise for us, if there's any information you can share from actually attending.
It's actually I was surprised. It's a very small court. There was only probably room for 100, and only 50 people were there. But the importance of it could be seen by a panel of 6 judges. And then you had a row of lawyers for the council, and then you had a row of lawyers for the representing Jehovah's Witnesses as well, and then also the 2 Bethel representatives that were sitting being interviewed. And it was a very formal proceeding where you had everyone had to stand. The 6 judges came in, sat down, and then Angus Stewart started speaking.
Okay, so only space for 100. When you say that, I'm envisioning a Kingdom Hall, which is essentially the seating capacity of a Kingdom Hall. So, because when you're watching it, it seems like quite a vast area that it's taking place in, but that seems like quite an intimate gathering that you're describing.
Yeah, so the court is probably about the size of a small Kingdom Hall, but then there's a very big milling area out the back. So there's a large room out the back. There's several breakout rooms where the different legal teams were sitting, and then there was also another breakout room, and there's a very tight security as well. So when you came in, they would scan you down. You had to walk through as you would in an airport, getting just checked for security reasons. So I guess some of these situations are fairly important and emotional, so they do check that nobody is coming in with anything that might be harmful.
So if you were hypothetically carrying weapons for the Watchtower representatives, you would have been foiled.
Yes.
So
Paul, can I ask you if, Paul, were there any members of the press in attendance?
Yeah, so the press had their own room as well. So there was about probably 4 or 5 different rooms that people were sitting in from different areas. I went to the very first one back in 2015 as well. So in one of the rooms there was the press set up, and they had several computers that they were using. In the other room there was Some of the different people were getting interviewed. Each had their own room and their legal representation.
And were there, did you know of any abuse survivors who were present at the hearings, Paul, or did you know of any Jehovah's Witnesses who were possibly still believing Jehovah's Witnesses who were there out of curiosity? Did you see any of those in the audience?
Yeah, so I was quite surprised actually at the range of people that were there. There was I didn't personally know this time any of the abuse survivors, but there were a group of people wearing T-shirts with slogans about protecting children, which they were some of the abuse survivors that I saw later in the news report. When I was in the lift, I actually asked this girl that was in the lift with me whether she was a Jehovah's Witness or not, and she said she was. And then I told her that I wasn't, and she made some funny comment about, "Oh, that's not a problem." I'm not sure what that meant, but we didn't have a chance to get into a discussion about whether that was a good thing or not. And then I had an interesting experience when I was in there, that I met some people that I knew that are Jehovah's Witnesses, an older couple, and I asked them, "Oh, are you still Jehovah's Witnesses?" And they went on to say that they're still Jehovah's Witnesses. They very much believe it's the truth, that this is where they learnt the truth. They haven't changed their opinion at all, but they do realise that there's been corruption has gotten into the top of the organisation. They've had people that have suffered greatly at the hands of the elders during abuse situations, and so they were there to see what could happen to force the organisation to actually act in a more Christian way.
Wow,
that's fascinating.
It also it was
why do you suppose that?
So I was going to say it's very very intriguing to me that these people would be there. That here are people that are just, there's so much cognitive dissonance there, that they see the absolute the damage the religion is doing, the total corruption in the way that the religion is mishandling this whole situation, unwilling to change, unwilling to take advice, and then willingness to lie and still go, this is Jehovah's organisation, and not allow it to affect that belief.
Mm.
I would imagine there are a number of witnesses in that mindset, but it's just that they've gone to the trouble of actually going to the hearing rather than just burying their heads in the sand. I think in a way you can admire that. You know, they're wanting to kind of see what happens. Now, a little bird tells me, Paul, that you had a conversation with Angus Stewart. I don't know. I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but is that true? You don't have to tell us what was said if you don't feel comfortable. But did you actually manage to talk to Angus?
Yes, I've actually spoken to Angus on a number of occasions.
Oh, right. Okay.
I met with, before the previous sessions in 2015, I was corresponding with him via email, and also I'd speak to him after each session. So he's obviously done a huge amount of research, and part of that research was reading through the different websites, such as my website. So he knew of me very well before I even met him, and there were several things that had been said over the different sessions that weren't always completely accurate. So I would go up and sort of just try and clarify things.
Oh, fantastic! You would actually go to where he was standing, would you?
Yes, you couldn't actually walk right up. So they have a gate between the two sections, but I'd go up and speak to there was a couple of people there that were looking after the gate, and they would call him over and he would come and speak. So I also had some emails that I sent him about a couple of different points. I noticed Angus had an incredible knowledge about how the whole religious organisation works, and very incredible knowledge about all the doctrine. But there's always, as it is if you haven't grown up in it, there's always a couple of areas that you just don't really understand the terminology, or don't know the whole situation. So he was sort of actually quite interested to speak to me, which was great, because he's such a pleasant and intelligent man. It was an honour just to speak to him.
Well, I don't want to, go overboard with, fanboying here, Paul, but I can't think of a better person to just have on hand if you're Angus Stewart than Paul Grundy. So that's really good that he had you available to him. Yeah,
the actual comment that I made to him this time was, there was a really important section there where they mentioned about disassociation, and so if a person cannot be part of the organisation, they will disassociate, and then they don't have a choice but to disassociate ethically. And there was a lot of conversation around that and whether disassociating is shunning or being shunned and everything. And that's not a terribly common thing to happen. It obviously does happen, but it's not the most common thing that happens. So what I mentioned, because I think this is a situation that happens a lot more, is that a person who's been abused will be disfellowshipped. They've got some incredible emotional issues that arise because of that, and often those emotional issues lead to self-medication through using drugs and cigarettes and drinking alcohol or sexual promiscuity. And so even though they want to be part of the organisation, they actually get disfellowshipped. And I thought that way, if they'd brought it in through that line, then the Spinks couldn't try and wriggle out by trying to say that the abused victim was shunning the organisation and not the other way around. So Angus thought that was a very interesting point, and hopefully some of what's then written about this will be framed in that way, that whether they choose to disassociate or whether they're disfellowshipped from their ongoing actions, that's cruel what happens to them at the end.
Yeah, and that was really brought out, I think, the reaction, the very palpable disgust of McClellan in particular with the shunning. But I guess before we delve too much into that, we should start with our discussion points, because viewers should know that in preparation for this discussion, we've basically selected 14 points from the public hearing from case study 54 that we found interesting. We're going to see how far we can get through them, bearing in mind the limitations of Skype and the fact that this is a multinational link. We've got America, we've got the UK, we've got Australia and Croatia. Something is bound to go wrong, but we're going to do our best to see how far we can get through the list. So first up on the list, I'm going to now show you a few clips from the opening address of Angus Stewart.
Given that the governing body is based in the United States, the Royal Commission does not have the power to compel a member of the governing body to give evidence in this hearing. Nevertheless, on 16 January this year, the Royal Commission wrote to Watchtower Australia requesting that a member of the governing body be available to give evidence at this hearing, whether in person or by video link. On 31 January, Watchtower Australia informed the Royal Commission that a member of the governing body would not be available to give evidence. That is a matter of considerable regret, given the degree to which the Australia branch is subject to the control of the governing body on matters of policy, procedure and practice. The Royal Commission found that the Jehovah's Witnesses did not respond adequately to child sexual abuse and did not adequately protect children from the risk of sexual abuse. The Royal Commission is expected to hear evidence that the Jehovah's Witnesses believe there are no impediments to developing and implementing responses to most of the concerns in case study 29. Despite this evidence, the Royal Commission will hear that the Jehovah's Witnesses have failed to address many of the recommendations arising from case study 29. The Royal Commission will hear evidence that of the 17 allegations of child sexual abuse that the Jehovah's Witnesses in Australia have received since case study 29, they have reported 15 allegations to the authorities. In both cases that were not reported, the adult survivors of historical abuse elected not to report, and the Jehovah's Witness organisation abided their decisions. Finally, the Royal Commission found that the Jehovah's Witnesses' practice of shunning members who disassociate from the organisation potentially puts survivors in an untenable position. The organisation has failed to address the particularly devastating practice of shunning survivors who disassociate from the organisation because of their abuse.
So many things to dissect about what was said there in those opening remarks. Covert, is there anything that stands out for you?
Well, the thing that really jumped out at me was the fact that there was a lot of speculation in the run-up to case study 54. Is Jeffrey Jackson going to appear again? is any member of the governing body going to appear again? And to put this into context, we have to bear in mind the only reason they got Jeffrey Jackson last time is because the Royal Commission requested him because he was in Australia, so he had to go. This time, obviously, Jeffrey Jackson, I would imagine, was trying to keep himself in completely the opposite hemisphere to Australia to make sure that couldn't happen. And sure enough, we see here Angus Stewart confirm that, yes, the Royal Commission reached out to the governing body and said, would anyone be available to take part in these very important hearings regarding, the abuse of children in your organization, which should be a priority for any religious leadership to get a grip on. And the governing body's response was, we are not interested in appearing. The Royal Commission reached out to them at the beginning of January, so the governing body had lots of time to organise their schedules, get a video link. They didn't even have to fly to Australia. They could have just sat on a Skype call for half an hour and taken questions, and they couldn't find the time to do that. And I find this incredibly interesting because this fits a pattern we've seen in recent years with the governing body. Unlike perhaps the figure of Paul, who stood in the Sanhedrin fearlessly defending the faith, or even Charles Taze Russell and Joseph Rutherford, who would publicly defend and engage in debate, the governing body in recent years, they've run away from investigative journalists, as they did from Trey Bundy. They refused to appear in court summons in the US. And here we have them, despite Jeffrey Jackson claiming in the previous Royal Commission that he was happy to testify, he obviously wasn't prepared to appear here. And I think that speaks realms as to the manner of the governing body, and quite frankly I think it's quite cowardly that they refuse to appear in front of such an important investigation dealing with such an important subject in the religion that they control.
Indeed, it didn't bode well for the organisation. It's interesting as well how there was really no punches pulled by Angus in saying, quite frankly, that the policies of Jehovah's Witnesses didn't adequately protect children. He also listed all of the areas in which Watchtower was expected to respond, but he also said that he said that Jehovah's Witnesses, there would be evidence that Jehovah's Witnesses have failed to address many of the recommendations. John, were you surprised by any of this? Was this more or less what you were expecting?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I was not surprised that Jackson or anyone else from headquarters failed to appear. And I think it's important for our listeners to understand really what the mentality is of the leaders of the organization, including the branch members in Australia. They really feel like they're being bullied by the commission. In fact, I had an opportunity to speak to Vincent Toole, who's the lead attorney for Watchtower in Australia, and he did give testimony back in 2015. And I had a chance to have an off-the-record discussion with him. And during that discussion, he made it clear that Watchtower was being bullied by the commission. And they really feel like the entire commission is apostate-driven. So when you don't accept the fact that these people, including Justice McClellan and Counselor Stewart and the entire commission of researchers and the panel of people who are interviewing witnesses, and not just for Jehovah's Witnesses, but for all institutions, when you say that they are apostate-driven, you really impugn the integrity of the investigation. But that's what Vincent Toole told me. He said that they were apostate-driven, and that the commission was trying to bully Watchtower. So when you feel like you're being bullied, you're certainly not going to appear on camera, and it's not a surprise to me at all that Watchtower New York or any other branch committee members from the U.S. or elsewhere, they had no interest in being a part of this.
And Paul, I found it interesting that it mentioned that of 17 allegations of child sex abuse since the last hearing, 15 had been reported to the authorities, unlike the 1006 before that. What is there a feeling, do you think, among the commission that at the very last minute they're kind of making this show of conformity with what the commission is saying?
No, not at all. The Angus Stewart was very upset with how the representatives behaved. He was very well aware that how dishonest that they were being, how underprepared they were, and how they were sort of trying to weasel out of answering any questions. So, in the discussion we had, what the feeling is that they are trying to get out of any legal issues, that they know that they do have to go forward now because they risk being sued if they're breaking the law. What was one of the most interesting moments, I think, in 2015 was when Justice McClellan had said, do you realise that you had a legal obligation to report because you have judicial committees, you have evidence, it's not just an allegation, what you have is actual evidence of abuse and you weren't reporting it. And you could see Vin Tool have a light bulb moment that we can get sued over this. So they don't feel that the witnesses are doing this out of respect for the commission or that they've changed their ways, but simply that they're trying to avoid any legal obligation that's coming up.
Interesting. So that brings us on to our next point of interest. And I'm now going to show you a few clips of an interesting exchange that happened regarding secrecy in one of Watchtower's documents.
In the main paragraph in that letter, I don't intend reading it, but you'll see that much emphasis is placed on the confidentiality of the S66 document, and it says as to who specifically it can be given to, including that it's not to be given to service desk secretaries. What's the secrecy or confidentiality concern with regard to this guide to service desks?
Again, I probably can't answer for the reason that it was written there, but I guess those of us on service desks have been given a heavy responsibility, as we see it, to ensure that we meld together the August 1 letter and the service desk guidelines. It's a responsibility we take very seriously in giving advice out. So my reading of it was simply that it's the responsibility of the service desk to make application of it and has ownership of the document. Beyond that, I couldn't comment.
We appreciate that someone from outside the organisation might struggle to understand why there should be such secrecy with regard to something which is a procedural document as to how matters should be handled procedurally. Do you see that?
I recognise that, and this came up in the earlier public hearing, that there's no doubt that some of our correspondence, it's well understood by the audience it's intended for, but read from a critical perspective, and we appreciate that, that it could be seen that way. Our understanding of it, or our application of it, is the elders have a letter that applies to their function and role. The service desks have guidelines that are specific to their function and role, and there's some reasonable amount of discretion required in the application of that on a case-by-case basis. But I take your point.
So, what a fascinating exchange, highlighting just how insular and confidential some of these documents can be. Kuva, did you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I think this does illustrate the kind of culture of secrecy that goes on inside inside kind of the organisation that runs the religion. Angus Stewart, he kind of points out that it seems to an outsider almost as if the Jehovah's Witnesses aren't allowed to know the rules that govern their lives. This is actually, for someone looking in from the outside, this might seem to be an unusual or a strange thing, but this is actually this kind of thing of keeping details of how the organisation is run and how the rules work, keeping that away from the rank and file witnesses, is actually fairly common within the organisation and has been for a very long time.
One of the things that really struck me was a kind of overriding frustration on the part of Angus Stewart at there being so many parts of the hierarchy that each have different documents, and where there's and especially when you have clauses like this regarding secrecy, there is ample opportunity for even policies that are understood to not be followed through. Do you think this might have been a concern, Paul, by the commissioners, the fact that the left hand might not know what the right hand's doing with Watchtower?
Yes, I found it quite interesting just to see that Terry O'Brien kept saying how that wasn't his department, he didn't know the answer for that. Spinks didn't know the reasons for things. You have, even when Jeff Jackson was speaking before, his department wasn't the department that dealt with information. And here you have like the two top people in Australia, top person globally, and none of them claim any responsibility, even Vin Tool, for knowing who sets the policy or what the policy is. So it was difficult to work out whether they were all pretending to be ignorant just so they didn't have to answer correctly, or whether it just is a very poorly run organisation with so many departments that one side doesn't know what the other side is doing.
It must,
or indeed both.
Yeah. It must just look so odd, though. We had Angus saying, can you not see how this must look to outsiders, that the organisation has this much secrecy? John, surely this is not something that will have come across well on Watchtower's part.
No, and having come off right on the heels of the Stephanie Fessler case in Philadelphia, we saw the same thing where the Watchtower attorneys did nothing but, I hate to beat a dead word, but they obfuscated, and the jury saw it. And of course, in the Australian Commission, we don't have a jury, but we do have the jury of public opinion, and we do have the multiple member panel that are witness to the behavior of Watchtower. And I think it was Angus Stewart who actually called it a dual practice. So in his description of this, what they were saying was, he called it a dual practice, that the congregants are being kept from this information which the body of elders has access to. So really they were asking why. Why is it that we can't have one set of rules that both the congregants and the elders who are there to spiritually shepherd the flock are aware of? Why is there this secrecy? And so really what you're getting to here is that we have a cloak of secrecy that's only common to organizations that are cult-like, as opposed to organizations that are open and organizations that put these documents out not only on the internet but for everyone to see. So you don't find this kind of secrecy with organizations such as YMCA or even the Catholic Church, because they recognize it has to be available to the public. If you notice the answer, though, that Spinks gave, the answer was extremely confusing, because he said that he understands what the criticisms were, and he said that from our perspective, it's audience specific. So he really didn't give an answer. That was something he said all
the way through, wasn't he? He kept saying, "Oh, it's the audience, it's the audience."
Right. So what does that really mean?
Yeah.
It means they're giving very strict instructions to elders that the elders are one audience, and Jehovah's Witnesses, the lay persons, the congregants, are a completely different group. Well, why is that? Why do we have such separation? And, his only answer at the end was, well, I take your point. That's really all you could say.
Yeah, you mentioned the Fessler case before. If you just check back to the last episode of Watchtower in Focus, viewers, you will have seen our discussion on that case. One of the key problems with Watchtower's handling of Stephanie Fessler was their refusal to report what was happening, the abuse that she was suffering, which brings us on to our next point in case study 54, which was some interesting exchanges regarding mandatory reporting. I'll show you a few clips now.
Now, as you'll be aware, Mr. O'Brien, coming back to you, in case study 29, the Royal Commission found that it's a general practice of the Jehovah's Witness organisation in Australia not to report allegations of child sexual abuse to the police or other authorities unless required by law to do so. You're aware of that finding, of course.
I'm aware of the finding, but we have never had a practice of not reporting.
Well, Mr. O'Brien, we went through this on the previous occasion, so I don't want to spend time on it, but of the 1,006 cases, if I recall correctly, not one was reported by the Jehovah's Witnesses organisation.
I think the point was brought out that hundreds were reported, not by the organisation, because the organisation doesn't report. That's left to the elders handling the case.
In relation to reporting where there's an assessment of harm, can you identify, just for ease of reference, where in the 3 documents that's reflected?
Yeah, again, if I could refer that
Yes,
to
of
Mr.
course.
Spinks, he's more expertise on that.
Sure. So in the child safeguarding policy dated March 7 and point number 9, it says if congregation elders learn of a case of child abuse in which a child may still be at risk of harm, they will ensure that a report to the police or other appropriate authorities is made immediately.
Right. Thank you. Yes. And in the other documents?
So obviously in the publications which were tendered at the previous public hearing, our publications have been saying that for decades. That if
When the document says the elders learn of a case of child abuse, are we to understand that as learn of an allegation?
Correct.
Why doesn't it say that?
I think it's a good suggestion. It's a poor choice of words, but that's the reference is of an allegation.
You see 8 speaks and 7 speak in terms of allegation. There was no intention to have a different meaning, was there?
Again, the practice is clear, Your Honour, and I think that's testified to by the fact that in each case over recent years, as we've documented, the policy is significantly, or practice is significantly different to 30 years ago.
So in the circumstance I put to you, you would tell the police?
You mentioned an adult survivor, so I just may be confused.
Yeah, an adult survivor who comes to you and says, I've been abused, and it's pretty clear, but for the fact that you don't have a second witness, that this person's telling you the truth.
Your Honour, at the Commission, in the publications, Your Honour himself has said that some individuals, adults, choose not to report and recognise that...
No. What obligation do you think you have under law in that circumstance?
With an adult survivor, to comply with whatever mandatory reporting requirement.
So you've identified in paragraph 9 of this 7 March document, but the fact of the matter is that, isn't it, and by all means I'm asking the question so you can show me if I've misread it or overlooked it. The other 2 documents, the one that guides service desks and the one that guides elders, don't have any statement to this effect. In other words, that a report should be made to the authorities if a child is considered to be at harm or at risk.
That's not clear, as clearly stated in those. It's not clearly stated in those documents. It's a valid point.
So some interesting exchanges there on mandatory reporting, and sitting in the audience during these exchanges was Paul Grundy. So Paul, what was going through your mind when O'Brien was making these claims regarding the conformity of Watchtower with mandatory reporting?
So Terry O'Brien makes the comment. He says, I'm aware of the finding, but we have never had a practice of not reporting, which is an absolute lie. I was absolutely stunned to hear him say that. And Angus Stewart brought up that, well, there was 1,006 cases that you didn't report. And I'm not quite sure where Terry was going with this, because as they mentioned, until just recently, they did not report. In fact, they actively discouraged victims even going and reporting it sometimes in the past. So I think
his argument seemed to be to shift. I may be reading it wrong, but his argument seemed to be to shift everything onto the elders and the families. In other words, to render the whole process of the commission obsolete, because he was more or less saying that reporting wasn't an institutional issue. I may have been reading it wrong.
Yes, I sort of saw this from potentially 2 angles. One is exactly that, they're trying to say that it's not the organisation's responsibility, it was the elders' responsibility. So if an elder fell short, that was their issue and their legal issue, because again, it's coming down to not wanting to be sued. or the other side was that in Australia they have mandatory reporting laws for evidence of abuse, but they do not have mandatory reporting for accusations of abuse. So all along they've said we don't report any accusations of abuse because legally in the states and territories of Australia we do not have to report accusations, and that's where I think there's this fine line that they didn't, an accusation there was no point or no legal obligation to report, but as they gathered evidence or as they got confessions from the abuser, that they then did have an obligation to report. And that's where I'm not sure sort of which tack they're taking there, but either way, Terry's trying to get out of any legal responsibility. I wouldn't mind saying as well about Terry O'Brien, because I know him very well. I did my pioneer school with Terry O'Brien, and he is an incredibly gentle and kind person. And he also gave a speech at my father's funeral. So they had two different. Yes, they had two brothers come for my father's funeral. So both from Bethel. The first one gave the proper funeral speech, and then Terry O'Brien got up and spoke for another 10 minutes or so as well. And so on the one hand, I'm like, he's a person that I really think is a genuine, nice person. And then on the other hand, you see him, just the way he was behaving, the way he was trying to avoid actually answering things. And I was quite confused actually watching him going, are you just stuck in a situation that you just wish you weren't in, or do you believe what you're saying? It was quite confusing. And I wanted to talk to him after the events, but as he got off the stage and walked out, he just kept his head to the floor, looked very unhappy and didn't look at anyone, and just basically just snuck out. So I couldn't catch his eye to go up and talk to him.
So it's safe to say he couldn't get out of there fast enough. Wow.
Yes, he was very uncomfortable about the whole proceedings, unlike Spinks, who looked very obstinate about it.
He looked quite smug, didn't he, Spinks?
Yes. I just remember in 2015, he's a very, very, very short man, extremely short, and he has his wife who's quite a lot larger than him, and she came up and collected him as he was walking out last time, and they're walking along, and one of the child abuse victims shouts out, going, "Spinks, you're a pedophile." And I was right next to him as he turned to his wife, and he goes, "See, the Bible said that we would be victims of persecution." And that was his response to that. So you could see this incredible smugness and absolute no remorse for anything that he said or anything that the organisation has done.
Now, that's interesting, by the way, to have a little bit of background on the personality of the man. He certainly doesn't seem very endearing when you watch his testimony. I'm just interested in this new child safeguarding document, which we're going to be talking about more a little bit later. But essentially, they have at the very last minute. The hearing was on March the 10th, and on March the 7th, they've produced a child safeguarding document, which we're not able to look at yet. But we're led to believe is based on the UK child safeguarding document. And on the issue of mandatory reporting, Spinks read from the document a paragraph that suggests that Watchtower, at first glance, suggests that Watchtower is now reporting. But there are a few caveats. I just want to read the paragraph again. The paragraph says, if congregation elders learn of a case of child abuse in which a child may still be at risk of harm, they will ensure that a report to the police or other appropriate authorities is made immediately. Now, at first glance, you're reading that thinking, fantastic, they're now doing mandatory reporting. But there are three things to notice about this. First of all, and this was brought out in the I think by McClellan, it says, if congregation's elders learn of a case, it doesn't say accusation. And obviously in witness lingo, they could argue among themselves that they don't have to report unless they have established through a case that child abuse has occurred. So that's clever use of language. And the second point is that it says in which a child may still be at risk of harm. It was brought out in the commission, as we're going to go into a little bit later, that says nothing about other children or children who are now at risk despite the abuse taking place many, many years ago. And the third thing about this, which is worth noting, is that the child safeguarding document, at least in the UK, is not really a policy document insofar as it's not something that the elders would go to when they're looking for information on how to handle child abuse. If an elder is dealing with child abuse, Paul, surely they're going to go to the Shepherd the Flock of God book and the August 1st, 2016 letter.
I mean, I think that what they will do is call the service department. That's where the guidelines are always call the service department. And from the information that Spinks and O'Brien were giving, I really got the feeling that they do not want to report unless they have to. So they still were framing it that if the law says that we have to report accusations, we will. Not that we will report accusations yet because it's not mandatory. The big change, I think, has been that they're now not discouraging the victim from going to report it. So they're trying to put the onus on the victim to report it, at least not discourage it anymore, but they won't go beyond the absolute minimum requirement of reporting unless they absolutely have to. And that is the situation of, we know that a child is being abused and is in danger, then we do realise we have an obligation to report. But other than that, they seem to be still holding out from just reporting every accusation.
Fascinating. So that brings us really on. Sorry, did you want to say something, Covert?
Just the only thing that kind of occurred to me in addition to what's already been covered is that the Spinks keeps saying, oh, you've misunderstood. Okay, the policy might not say it, but in our practice we would do X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
Stuart keeps coming back to the fact that no. You can say whatever you like as your practice, but we need to see it in your policy documents, because ultimately all we can see are your policy documents. And Stuart keeps bringing Spinks back to this. Spinks says, oh, it's not in the policy document, but our practice is to do X, Y, Z. And he's either being deliberately obstructive, or he may genuinely, and this is the thing, sometimes I wonder with Watchtower, I think it might be a combination of obstruction and incompetence, that they don't realise this thing has to be in the policy document. Otherwise, you can claim anything you like, but if it's not in your policy document, the Commission has no idea as to whether or not people will actually be told to do it. And it's a recurring theme throughout this particular part of the Commission. They go back and forth over it.
In fact,
McClellan...
Sorry, go on.
Sorry, McClellan made the same point there, where he said that if you don't have this clearly outlined, there's the concern that you'll just slip back into previous practices. So even if they say that with all good intentions, unless it's clearly written, then they just won't keep doing this over time.
Yeah, I'm glad that he made that point, because it's one thing, like you say, for them to say, oh, well, in practice we do this. But the whole point is that if it's not written in the policy document, then they're not bound to anything and they can just make things up as they go along. So I was really glad when McClellan brought that point out. So we're going to move on to our next point, which is, and I alluded to it slightly earlier, there was an interesting exchange in which Angus Stewart highlighted the fact that the wording of Watchtower policies doesn't specify the difference between a child being at risk and any child being at risk. I'm going to show you those clips now.
And in paragraph 7, it says, if the victim is still a child under 16, is he or she still in danger? In other words, this is a question that must be asked. If so, the service department will provide necessary direction to ensure the child's protection. Now, you see that it doesn't ask whether there's another child in danger.
I think, again, these are notes. I'm not in the legal department. These are the notes of the legal department, but I think the safeguarding policy uses the generic child, but I agree again that should say if a child is, or any child is still in danger. That's a good point.
And related to that is, even if the victim at the time that the call is taken is an adult, it doesn't deal with the question of what to do if other children are still at home. So in other words, a 20-something, 30-something-year-old reports abuse by someone who's still in the congregation. The particular person's abuse occurred many, many years before, but that there are other children potentially at harm because of that abuser still being there. This doesn't deal with that.
You'd have to excuse my ignorance, I'm not a lawyer, Mr. Stewart, but does the Act that supports this advice make that point? I'm not certain. This is only the legal advice, is the point I'm making.
You're effectively making the point, which is this, is why do you legalise it all the time and rely always on what the law provides? Why do you as an organisation just not adopt the policy, as many other organisations do, of reporting as a matter of course if there are still children who might be in harm's way?
So, John, that was actually quite an interesting distinction that was drawn there. The fact that it's one thing to try to make sure that the specific victim is no longer at risk. It's another thing entirely to make sure that children in general aren't at risk.
Yeah, I think this is something that the organization as a whole globally fails to realize, is that they don't seem to have a protection in place for anyone other than their own children, and even that is sorely lacking. So this came up in the Fessler case, where it was presented to the witnesses that were on the stand, including Thomas Jefferson from the United States Branch Committee, and the two elders, and they asked them, do you feel that you have any obligation to protect the public? And they straight out answered no. So when you have an organization that is, supposedly insular in protecting their own children, they seem to be forgetting that these children come in contact with other individuals, or the perpetrators come in contact with children that are not Jehovah's Witnesses, and they don't seem to have any concern over accusations that are made that might affect persons that are not Jehovah's Witnesses. So I really had a tough time swallowing my own conversation with Vincent Toole, because one of the things that really disturbed me in that regard is the fact that he placed the blame, or he placed the load of responsibility on, obviously, the parents, on the victims themselves. And what he said to me was that we don't have the right to take away the rights of the individual to report to the police. So that's really not what the issue is. But he's saying we don't have the right to take away their legal rights or responsibilities to go to the authorities. So in other words, he's really saying that it would be wrong for us to make these accusations or make these reports to Child Protective Services and to the police, because we're taking away your rights. And that's absurd, and everyone knows it's absurd, but that's the legal mindset and strategy of the organization. And he said, if you go to the police, we'll follow you all the way. We'll support you all the way as a parent or as a victim, as a child, but we're not going to take away your right to do that, which is absurd.
Yeah, it really... Sorry, go on, Covert.
So I have 2 points, just to briefly stray into a point we may cover later, but just to follow up on the first point John made. One of the massive issues of this, in many ways, this is not a religious issue. This is a public safety issue. Watchtower keeps trying to frame it as a religious one, but the reality is that this is a public safety issue. This is about dangerous sexual predators not being handed over to the police, and that's just not putting the witness kids at risk. That puts all children at risk. The second point here is actually one of the points they brought out in the way that Watchtower has framed its current policy, is they say they'll report if there is a child still at risk, but a flaw, Stuart brings this out. Okay, so what if you have a situation where the person who is the abuse victim is reporting this abuse 20 years later, so they are now no longer at risk, they're 30 years old, but the person they're talking about, the person they're making the accusation about, is still in the congregation and he's still surrounded by young children. Would you consider that to be a scenario in which case you would be compelled to report? And you kind of, if you read through Spinks's response on it, you get, he says, well, you have to excuse my ignorance, I'm not a lawyer, what does the law say on this? But and Stuart brings it back to say, well, why are you legalising it all the time? I'll read it. Mr. Spinks, you are effectively making the point, which is this: why do you legalise it all the time and rely always on what the law provides? And then Stuart makes the point, why do you as an organisation not just adopt the policy, as many other organisations do, of reporting as a matter of course if there are still children who might be in harm's way? And then Spinks, well, with respect, Mr. Stuart, that's a very isolated point. This is the legal advice I've been given. He doesn't directly answer the question because it's such a simple question that cuts right to the heart of the issue. But because Watchtower is unable to deal with that, it almost seems like Spinks again is ducking and being slippery, trying to get round it. It was infuriating to watch. And even looking at the transcript, I'm getting a little bit angry again because you could tell he knew what the point was, and he didn't want to answer it.
That's right. Yeah, he even at one point. Sorry, go on, Paul.
I think the Watchtower's shown through all of this that they don't understand that pedophilia is a condition that cannot be cured. The whole thing about you can reinstate a pedophile, they can still go preaching for the rest of their lives out in public, they can still become elders, shows that they think this is a sin, and as a sin we can pray and we can overcome all our sins. But the reality is that pedophilia in many cases is something that's completely uncurable, and by not recognising it in that light, they still are just going through the minimum legal requirement rather than going as a protection to everyone. We have an ethical responsibility to just report this for the safety of everybody.
Indeed, and yet when repeatedly pressed on reporting, as Covert mentioned, there was just denials, and at one point Angus Stewart said, why is it that the Jehovah's Witness organisation has not adopted a standard policy to report allegations of child sexual abuse to the authorities? And Spinks replies, we do, Mr. Stewart, if it needs to be better documented. So, it's not in the documents at all. And, we brought out that the very latest last-minute safeguarding policy has something about reporting. But this is not in the elders manual, this is not in the elders letters, this is not in the service department instructions. As far as I'm concerned, the safeguarding document, if it's anything like the one we've seen from the UK, can just be shoved in a cupboard somewhere and no one ever looks at it.
Yeah, I think we have a real problem on our hands. Well, the Jehovah's Witness organization does, because they're a very slow-moving global organization that insists that all of their policies and doctrines come from the Bible as interpreted by the governing body, and those have to be global in nature. They are not willing to apply to local laws the very critical concept that all allegations must be made to Childline or to Child Protective Services or to the police in various areas, because they're a global organization that is cultured on the very concept that all things must all speak in agreement. In fact, that's one of the concepts of being an elder, is that they must all speak in agreement and come up with the same unanimous answer. Even if one or two of the members of the body disagree, they still have to come up with a unanimous decision, and that's causing a real problem for the organization, because they're trying to apply their understanding of the scriptures on these matters in the two-witness rule in a way that is completely disregarding victims and disregarding the laws of Australia, the UK, and the United States, and all the other countries that have independent child mandatory reporting laws.
Now, as far as the two-witness rule is concerned, I'm glad you mentioned that, John, because there is actually some notorious material to be found in the KS10, the Shepherd book, which was actually touched on in the commission, and I'm now going to show some clips from when Angus Stewart read from this famous part of the Shepherd book.
Yes, now this is going on to the next sentence at paragraph 39 of Shepherd. If the accuser or the accused is unwilling to meet with the elders, or if the accused continues to deny the accusation of a single witness and the wrongdoing is not established, So I take it not established scripturally, i.e. under the two-witness rule. Would that be right?
That's correct.
The elders will leave matters in Jehovah's hands. So the result of that is this, isn't it? And I think it's stated in the recent policy document, that even if someone who's accused of child sexual abuse is convicted beyond a reasonable doubt by a criminal court, if the scriptural rule of evidence, the two-witness rule, is not met within the Jehovah's Witnesses' internal processes, then the matter is left in Jehovah's hands.
That's, again, totally incorrect, and I apologise for being direct with it, Mr Stewart, but, and I'm sure it's unintentional, but you are, and the transcript will show, we've had this lengthy discussion at the first hearing. If I could be permitted to say, that bracketed section, you've gone on and read the part after it, the bracketed section is inserted there to say, when it relates to child sexual abuse, contact the branch, end of bracket. It now continues with what would be the normal judicial process that is perfectly clear to elders. I appreciate, again, it's about audience, but the bit that you read after that is not stating with regard to child sexual abuse. And in addition, you've added into the end of that statement that you just made that regardless of what the secular authorities would do, that wouldn't permit the congregation to act, when the documentation shows that's just completely incorrect.
So, Paul, a notorious part of the Shepherd Book containing some ridiculous language about leaving things in Jehovah's hands, and yet this preposterous material was out there on display at the Royal Commission.
Yeah, so this is a common thing that they use to try and help the victims feel okay about the injustice. The Watchtower of 1995 makes the same point. It says, what if the one accused, through denying the wrongdoing, is really guilty? Does he get away with it, as it were? Certainly not. The question of his guilt or innocence can be safely left in Jehovah's hands. Ultimately, Jehovah God and Christ Jesus render everlasting judgment in justice. So here they are pushing it off that the abused victim can feel satisfied that sometime in the future Jehovah will punish the wrongdoer. So it's a terrible concept, because it's saying, well, let's not do anything now, let's not worry about it now, because sometime in the future this will all be rectified.
The interesting point for me about this was the attempted defence by Spinks, because his attempted argument was that there's a part of the book that, in brackets, which talks about child abuse, and the intent of the brackets is quite clearly that when the elders are reading it, if it just so happens that it's to do with child abuse, that they're to ring the service desk. And then it's closed brackets, and the paragraph continues with the general thrust of the judicial process being that of the two-witness rule. And yet Spinks tried to make this outrageous argument that when the brackets closed on that part about child abuse, everything after those brackets had nothing to do with child abuse. Did I misread his argument?
Oh, sorry, I'm not sure about that.
Sorry.
I didn't notice that one.
Yeah. Oh, right, okay.
To be honest, that I think I have no idea what Spinks was trying to do there. I think you're right. I think your interpretation of it, Lloyd, is absolutely
It
the
sounds
closest
too
I can get
preposterous
to
to
it.
be true, but that's what it sounded like to me.
It sounds like, yeah, I have no idea what he was trying to say. It's very strange.
Just as confounding as the two-witness rule is a common claim made by Watchtower that reproving a paedophile serves as a protection. Let's take a look at some of the footage.
And so if we look at that document at tab 1, page 16, which is ringtail 31, right at the foot of the page, 7.14. So you say there in the first sentence, shunning a disfellowship child molester is and will continue to be Jehovah's Witness Bible-based response to this serious sin. Well, that depends, of course, on whether the person was disfellowshipped or reproved, doesn't it? If they were reproved, then they're not shunned.
Yes, that's correct. But here it's talking about the child molester. If
who is disfellowshipped, I beg your pardon, who is disfellowshipped. But if they're not disfellowshipped, then they're not shunned. Right?
No.
Right, and then goes on, this practice is an effective mechanism for protecting children in the congregation. Well, of course, I think we canvassed before that doesn't do anything for children outside the congregation. Would that be right?
Well, that's a position that's been taken, but again, we say that the congregation arrangement is one to protect the congregation from sin. We judge the matter of sin. We're not in competition with the legal justice system.
So, Covert, one thing that is obvious from these exchanges is that Watchtower just has no grasp of how ineffective things like reproving a pedophile or disfellowshipping a pedophile are when it comes to protecting not just the congregation but the community at large.
Absolutely. The idea that because somebody has been reproved for pedophilia means they are not going to offend again actually flies in the face of the expert testimony given by Watchtower's own witness. In case study 29, day 4, they invited Dr. Monica Applewhite. She was supposed to be there to testify on behalf of Watchtower. Of course, famously, her testimony fell apart. But even she actually stated that once a person has crossed the boundaries and they have abused a child, she has no confidence that they will not do that again, because somebody who is a child abuser, essentially they're kind of like an alcoholic. Once you're an alcoholic, you will always be one. Even if you don't drink for a while, you will have that propensity. So the idea that somebody could molest a child, convince the elders that they're sorry and just get a reproof does absolutely nothing to protect the congregation. In fact, it almost lulls people into a false sense of security. And so Stuart is bringing up here that although the witnesses were trying to protect it. Oh, we disfellowship child molesters to protect the congregation. And Stuart brings up, well, no, you also reprove them if they say they're sorry. And kind of then O'Brien tries to back off and say, well, we only deal with sin, we don't deal with crime, which of course misses the point that often the authorities don't get to deal with the crime because the case never finds its way to them. So Stuart again here is bringing out a significant child safety issue that again affects not only the children of Jehovah's Witnesses but potentially the children of everyone else in that particular community.
Yeah, that just
I think it's very
sorry, go on, Paul.
It's very important. Thank you. It's very important here that if they're disfellowshipped and not reported to the police, the pedophile is going into the community without anyone being aware of the situation. If they're approved, it's never actually mentioned to the congregation what the reproval is for. So that person is still within the congregation, and the parents of children generally may not be aware that they have a pedophile amongst their midst.
Yeah, it probably could have been pulled out a little bit more clearly, the fact, because it's such a glaring problem, and it's come up as well in the summary report that was published by the Royal Commission, that if you're reproving a pedophile, then you're essentially accepting their apology without letting any of the parents know, as Covert has just said. It's a glaring problem with the whole approach. Now, what's interesting, which brings us on to our next point, is the lack of flexibility in Watchtower's approach, because they, at one point in the proceeding, Terrence O'Brien more or less said, listen, regardless of what you guys tell us to do, we're going to do what we feel Jehovah is telling us to do. Take a look at this clip.
Could I just read one scriptural point, because not all of the commissioners were here for the hearing, and I think this is really the basis for our thinking on these scriptural matters on which we find disagreement. So we appreciate there's disagreement. This is in the Bible book of Isaiah, chapter 33, and it talks about the laws under which Jehovah's Witnesses believe we come. Chapter 33, verse 22, it says, "For Jehovah is our judge, Jehovah is our lawgiver, Jehovah is our King. So that covers every aspect of the legislative, the executive, the judicial process. All Jehovah God reserves to himself. And we understand scripturally he delegates some of that authority to congregations, to families, husbands, wives, parents. But ultimately, if God's word provides a direction on a certain doctrine, Jehovah's Witnesses are bound by that, regardless of how others may view that.
Well, I understand that's the position you take, and I'm not going to enter into a debate with you about how, as I did on the previous occasion, about how the Jehovah's Witnesses' position on a range of things has changed over the years, on blood transfusions and blood fractions, by way of example, and on a number of other things. So we'll leave all that to one side. But just to get back to my question, which I understand the answer is yes, and the question was, in response to the Royal Commission findings and recommendations in relation to shunning in the report for case study 29, you've not made any changes?
Well, the branch committee or the directors of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Australia are not authorised to be able to do that, Mr Stewart. That was a matter Mr Jackson would have taken back to the governing body, as he said he would.
So what a fascinating piece of drama. Watchtower digging its heels in and saying, listen, regardless of what you guys say, Jehovah is our king. Paul, what was it like when he pulled the Bible out on the commission? What was the mood like in the room?
I think this was the first time I really laughed in the proceedings there, because you have this panel of 6 very, very experienced, competent judges sitting there, and Terry O'Brien has basically said to them, Jehovah is our judge, what you say, what you think is irrelevant. And I was just, what are you thinking, Terry? Like, how on earth is this going to help you in any regards? Just showing that you're obstinate and they really have no right to tell you what to do. And yeah, the audience there was a mixture of humour and also shock that he would be so audacious.
I have a theory about this.
Go on, Covert. Please do tell.
I think they were playing to the audience, but not the judges and not the audience in the Ark. I think they know a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses are going to see this because the previous case study, the testimony's all on YouTube.
There seemed to be quite some theatre on O'Brien's part, didn't there?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think they know that. I mean, if you look at all the comments on the YouTube videos, there are lots of witnesses commenting. So I think they know that a lot of witnesses will see this, and they have to at least make some kind of scriptural stand to be seen there, to be, boldly proclaiming to the nations who are trying to make them break Jehovah's laws, to say, no, Jehovah is our judge and Jehovah is our king. I think I speculated in the run up to the Ark. I was curious as to how much they were going to try and be a bit cowardly to try and get out of being sued, but how they were going to balance that with not being seen to back down in front of the Worldly Commission. And I think that this was what a part of that was. I think they took the tactical choice that they were going to look a bit ridiculous in front of the judges in order so that they could look a bit spiritual in front of the witnesses who were going to see this.
Which is a complete contrast to, is it the Uniting Church that has taken the opportunity to offer a full apology? Can you imagine how good Watchtower would have looked in front of the Royal Commission if they had just taken a moment to say, we would just like to extend an apology to victims of our mishandling of abuse? Instead, they take the exact opposite approach and more or less say, listen, we don't care what you're wanting us to implement, what changes you're wanting us to make. We are answerable only to Jehovah.
I think it was interesting that the comment was made earlier by O'Brien that we're not in competition with the law or with the legal system. And that's somewhat a conflict because, Jehovah's Witnesses very strongly believe that they would, according to Romans 13, abide by Caesar's laws. And one of those laws would be, for example, if let's say you're an elder or anyone, you see a murder committed, you would pick up the phone and you would call the police. Or if someone steals your car, you pick up the phone, you call the police. In all of those cases of crimes, which are also sins, you don't see the organization saying, well, you must first pick up the phone and call the legal department in New York or in Sydney, right? You're not sanctioned. You're not criticized. You're not brought before the body of elders for taking the matter into your own hands and calling Child Protective Services when there's an allegation. So it's very difficult for the average witness to really understand these core issues and how O'Brien is using the Bible as a support for their argument. But the reality is that the Bible does not support their argument. And as we'll probably discuss later, Angus Stewart, in the end, really said that it all boils down to your interpretation of the Bible. And I think that's where Jehovah's Witnesses have to understand that their core issue is that this is an interpretation of the scriptures that is not in harmony with any other interpretation of any other religious body anywhere in the world. This is unique to Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah, so they're really speaking out of both sides of their mouth here. So on one side they're saying Romans 13 says that we can follow the law, we need to follow the law. But then Isaiah says that Jehovah's our judge, so we will follow what he says rather than what the law says. So they're really taking bets both ways there. But as you say, this all comes down to interpretation, and they can easily reinterpret all of these rules. The two-witness rule can easily be one child with other forensic evidence, or just not apply to children at all. And you can easily say that the Bible gives precedence for women being involved with judicial committees, etc. So it all comes down to interpretation. And I mentioned this to Angus. I don't understand what they stand to gain from not just going, these guidelines that the Commission is put out are for the benefit of the children, are for the benefit of our organisation. We can just follow them and reinterpret to fit around the rules.
Well, the core belief of Jehovah's Witnesses is that the very core of their belief is that they will obey Caesar's laws unless they conflict with God's laws. It's as simple as that. So obviously, if they're not obeying these mandatory child reporting laws, then therefore they feel in some manner that they are breaking God's law by reporting accusations of child abuse. There's really no other way to put it, because otherwise they would obey Caesar's law in the global handling of child abuse reports.
The interesting comment that Angus Stewart made when I mentioned that I couldn't see any of these rules that they couldn't interpret around the frame of the law to be able to protect the children and protect themselves legally. Angus felt that there's only one thing that they won't be able to reinterpret, and that is shunning. So he goes, you're still, your most damaging practice is shunning, and they can't change shunning because that is the control that your religion or the organisation has over their members.
Yeah.
Paul, there's one thing that I'd like to pick your brains on as an Australian. I just look at this whole kind of obstinate stance by the organisation, and really it was really well highlighted in three areas that I can think of: the two-witness rule, the involvement of women in the judicial process, and shunning. Those were all areas in which at various points during the hearing Watchtower dug their heels in and said, there's no way we're changing this. I'm just looking at the end game of all this and the broader picture. Obviously, this is not a court of law. This is a commission, the point of which is to inform lawmakers. What does the Australian government do with a religion that refuses to make reforms in such far-reaching aspects of its child abuse policy?
That is a question that after I walked away from Angus, I wish I had asked.
Yeah.
So
what's the point of it all,
I'm
basically?
not really sure.
Yeah.
I mean, this is Australia is a very sort of free democratic country, so there is a lot of freedom of speech, etc. So it's not likely to be able to do anything other than what the law states. If the law says that you need to report and you don't, then it will open up the religion, hopefully the organisation at the top level there, to being sued. It is a fairly progressive country, and so we have Senator Xenophon here is very strongly pushing about things like freedom of rights and around the Muslim issues at the moment, and around charity status, whether religions should be getting charity status, particularly when they're not offering anything productive. And I think similar to what's happening in France, Australia and France are sort of at the forefront of really opening up that religion still needs to report to the law. I think in the past the state has tried to keep away from religious organisations and give them a lot of free rein, whereas it's now coming in a lot more that no, religions still have to answer to the law. So I don't think they're going to encroach on people's freedom in this country, but if they can clearly define acceptable policy and law, then it will open the way to going, well, you now are answerable to that law regardless of your religious status.
Well, this is something that Covert and I have kind of been dealing with on Twitter. We've been, fielding a number of, because both he and I are on Twitter quite a lot. And there's quite a lot of debate over the whole issue with banning religions, because obviously there's the pending or the very likely ban of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia. And both Covert and I are arguing that it's wrong to ban a religion because all you're doing is violating people's rights, people's human rights to freedom of worship. But that surely doesn't mean that an organisation like Jehovah's Witnesses gets to enjoy tax-exempt or charitable status while, sticking its nose up at very reasonable requests regarding reporting and that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think that's, obviously it's a very wide-ranging debate, and the question of how far government should get involved is a really kind of sensitive, and it's a very complex one. But there are some, as Lloyd said, there are some very simple things I think that can be done. And one of them, we've got this problem in the UK. One of them is if you're an organisation that shuns and commands shunning, well, why on earth are you getting charity status? And ironically, I think Watchtower would be more upset about losing charity status than they would about Jehovah's Witnesses going to prison.
Yeah. No, I think I'm very much against what's sort of happening in the Soviet Union, because governments has as much corruption as religion. They don't have necessarily better intentions, and so to be restricting the freedom of religion is a big issue.
Exactly.
But ultimately, religion is about money. Like every organisation, you can only survive with money. So you need to go, if something illegal is happening, take away the charity status and sue people for what they are doing illegally. Once you start chipping away at that financial base, religion can't survive. It will be forced to change its practices in line what's legally acceptable.
Exactly. You want to see harmful religions being held to account, basically. And
yes.
Though you kind of see this with the Royal Commission, there's just this niggling thing in the back of your mind while you're watching it thinking, but what can they really do? Sorry, I'll let you.
So the Royal Commission can't do anything, can it? It's just it's framing. It's helping to frame practices, and hopefully that will help frame the law. But out of this, what is going to happen is that the law will be reframed to include some of these the guidelines that have come here, and also I think it's opened the eyes of many Jehovah's Witnesses that have been victims in Australia and completely mistreated by the elders, that they do have a legal stance to sue, because if these elders knew that there was a pedophile, a pedophile that has confessed and hasn't gone to the police, then they have broken the law, and so this opens the way for them to sue individually as well.
Indeed.
Yeah, I think that brings a very good point, because there's two ways to attack the problem. The one way is to handle it by using the government and the resources that we have, and as you pointed out, the Royal Commission is setting a framework for a future change. However, there's change going on right now in the court of public opinion. So, Paul, I wanted to ask you this question. Right now, as I understand it, the number of Jehovah's Witnesses in Australia has dropped fairly significantly over the past 10 years. Do you have any comment on the numbers? I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but as I understand, to use an expression that Lloyd likes to use, is Jehovah's Witnesses are voting with their feet and they're leaving. And as we've come to understand, many of those people in the U.S. and Australia and elsewhere have been leaving as a direct result of what they've uncovered as to the way the organization handles these child abuse cases.
Yeah, there's definitely been an effect here. I just know from the emails that I received from my website that the prominent or the primary reason that people are leaving that are contacting me in Australia has been what they've seen on the Royal Commission. The witnesses over the last 10 years haven't decreased, though they still have grown a very small amount. If you look at if you take into account the birth rate of Jehovah's Witnesses, they have grown by very, very marginally. And once you take into account the birth rate, they are declining now, and they have over the last 10 years in Australia. So this has definitely had an effect. Unfortunately, what I'm seeing is that people now are starting to hear about Jehovah's Witnesses in the general population, and they're quite astounded that witnesses shun and they protect the child abusers. But amongst Jehovah's Witnesses, they're still it's not being spoken about, and it's being just claimed to be apostate lies. So it hasn't had as big an effect as it should have if the information was freely available and honestly discussed amongst Jehovah's Witnesses. But it is good to see that they are declining now and dropping off less, or growing at least in the years they grow less than the population growth rate.
Now, Paul, I'm very interested to know your thoughts on the next talking point that we're going to deal with, because I'm going to show now, for the benefit of viewers, some clips of when the Commission turned its attention to shunning, and the defence given by Watchtower representatives was that those who disassociate themselves as witnesses are actually shunning the congregation. Take a look.
Could I just interrupt, Your Honour? I believe with the difference between disfellowshipping and disassociation, the congregation takes the action in disfellowshipping somebody who is then shunned. Person who disassociates themselves, they're taking the action. Now, for whatever reason, I agree, not even with regards to being a victim, others make the same decision. But they are actually taking the stand to shun the congregation from themselves. And they understand the implications of that. Now, it is, I agree, it puts them in a difficult situation, but it is a choice.
I'd say again, and we're going to appear very repetitive, I apologise, Your Honour, but the individual can choose.
Why is it necessary for the organisation to tell all of its adherents, you must shun that person?
Because the individual has not taken the decision to no longer associate or to no longer be involved with congregation activities, which is their right. They've taken the decision to say, I'm shunning the congregation, I'm no longer a part of the congregation, I put it in writing. So the individual takes that action, and we understand the implications. When someone is disfellowshipped, the congregation takes that action. So the individual does not need to put themselves in a position where they're shunned. They can walk away, they can go to another congregation. That's their personal choice. But we understand and agree with the point you're making, Your Honour.
That it's particularly damaging when a child sexual abuse victim leaves the organisation, disassociates from the organisation, and is then shunned.
Well, that would be true if they disassociate themselves, you're referring to.
Yes.
Because that is the policy. But again, I think, as I pointed out in my evidence, I think Mr. Jackson did as well, that here we're talking about somebody who is of an age where they have qualified for baptism. So they're somebody who's either approaching adulthood or an adult, making that decision, understanding the implications of choosing either to disassociate themselves, knowing the consequences will be shunning, or simply ceasing activity with the congregation, but not taking the stand of disassociation. So it's a choice.
Now, compare those comments with some comments that were made in only the March 2017 JW Broadcasting episode.
And how encouraging it is to see young ones getting baptized, publicly demonstrating that they are giving their lives to Jehovah. And we sincerely hope that you young ones who are not yet baptized will not hold back from getting baptized as soon as you qualify. The sooner you can get baptized, the sooner you will receive greater protection and blessings from Jehovah. Not long ago, it made me very happy to observe a little 10-year-old brother get baptized.
So, Paul, I think it's safe to say, comparing those two comments and those two bits of testimony, if you like, that there was clear deception from Terrence O'Brien when he was trying to insinuate that Jehovah's Witnesses who disassociate are basically responsible for their own shunning because they are aware and they are adults when they first get involved as witnesses.
Yeah, so this is the part of the whole proceedings where it got really animated in the audience. You could just see the huge amount of anger amongst the audience at just how unjust this whole section about shunning and being shunned and everything was. And I saw the judges all look up at the audience as well, because I think a few people in the audience really wanted to get up and just shout out about this, because, as you mentioned, there's experiences in Watchtowers where people as young as 7 are getting baptised, and you know, if you're not baptised by the age of 16, it's generally considered there's something wrong with you. It affected me personally, this comment too, because my mother, when I got this fellowship, said, well, you made the choice, you knew what you were getting into, and so you deserved the punishment of being shunned. And I was 16, and it's like, in Australia at 16, you're not allowed to smoke, you can't drive, you can't go to war, you can't vote, you can't drink, you're not allowed to get married, you're not allowed to have sex. And yet, by that age, you're supposed to be, according to Terry O'Brien, a baptised publisher who knew what they were getting into. They were approaching adulthood. So it was just like a completely unjust way of looking at things, and an excuse for why they could shun people that are really at an age they have absolutely no idea about what they are getting into and what the effects of being shunned are going to be on the rest of their lives.
Yeah, I'm just wondering whether Angus Stewart, I don't want to kind of, put you on the spot too much, but is this something that he and his team are going to be aware of? The fact that literally only a few days before Terrence O'Brien said that witnesses get baptised when they're either adults or approaching adulthood, a JW Broadcasting episode was quoting ages like 10, and the 2017 yearbook contains an experience of a kid who gets baptised at the age of 8. Is Angus Stewart aware of how obvious the lies are, is basically my question.
Yes, he is. So the first thing that we spoke about when I talked afterwards was that it was so frustrating to see the O'Brien and Spinks lying so much, and he mentioned that. And during his proceedings, because I've asked him how is he so controlled during all of this, he never seems to get visibly upset. He never bites back or anything. He just continues on in his very sort of controlled form of reasoning. And he said that, look, inside it's extremely frustrating, but it's his job to keep things controlled. But he goes, I could see that this was total bullshit, and that's the term he used, which I thought was...
He really used that term.
He's human after all. So yeah,
you heard it here first, folks.
Yeah, there's absolutely nothing was going. It was getting past them. They know the rules well enough. They've done so much research into the Watchtower religion that they were fully aware that this was totally unjust and also totally dishonest in what was being presented by the witness representatives.
It strikes me, I don't mean to digress, because I know we're dealing with shunning, and this question may be too much of a digression, but we know that Terrence O'Brien's skating on thin ice because the Commission have already directly accused him of lying during Case Study 29. And I know that in theory, if you lie to a Royal Commission, it can potentially land you in prison. You can go down for a number of years or be fined tens of thousands of pounds. And here we see O'Brien and Spinks are up there basically doing it again. I'm sure... it seems like they're playing with fire. I don't know if the Commission will choose to actually directly address it, or if that's something they think is desirable or not. But and I don't know if you know, but even if you do know, maybe they can't tell us or can't say what they're planning to do with that. But it strikes to me that especially O'Brien's really playing with fire there, because he's already come very close to the flames once, and he's lying about things which are blatant lies.
Well, just very briefly, I really appreciate what Covert said about that, because this is not the first time that O'Brien was in a very precarious position. And I'm sure Paul knows about this, but in 2013, there was a Victorian Commission, which was very similar to the Royal Commission, except it was just in the state of Victoria, Australia. And the two representatives of Watchtower were Terry O'Brien and Rachel Van Whitson, who was the female attorney for Watchtower. But I won't go into the details, and we can post a link on the video for anyone who wants to read the transcript. But that entire transcript is available from 2013. And during that transcript, the justices threatened O'Brien with contempt of court. And I think they would have done it if he had not cooperated any further. But again, he didn't really cooperate, and the same thing is happening in 2015, and the same thing again in 2017. So these attorneys like Stewart are well aware of the non-cooperative nature, and eventually you can't do that without it catching up to you, not only in the court of public opinion, but in a legal sense. They're not going to be giving the Watchtower any slack, because they've already been threatened with contempt.
Paul, I get the sense, Covert mentioned before about O'Brien skating on thin ice over his lies. I just get the sense, looking in on this, that there seems to be not a great deal of appetite to hold Watchtower representatives accountable for the subterfuge. I don't know what you think, Paul.
Yeah, I don't have any particular knowledge about this, but I do get the sense that the Royal Commission is being set up to help children. It's not about attacking any particular religious group, but actually helping them. And that's why it's so frustrating to Justice McClellan that the Jehovah's Witnesses and in line with them is the Catholic Church are just so unwilling to take that help. They are seeing it as an attack rather than assistance. So I don't think that they've got an intention to do anything further legally, but I do think it's interesting that John, you're talking about the case in Victoria. You had Vivian Ritz was the director of the Australian branch back then, and Terry O'Brien followed on from him. Viv's been sent over to Poland, and Terry now to, I think it was Vanuatu. How that both of those people have been sort of removed out of the country. That have been involved in these cases. And now we have, I think it's Winston Payne, they said, who is now the current director, who's had no involvement with any of this. So they've brought in someone totally fresh that is quite removed from these situations or cases.
Yeah, that's interesting.
You briefly mentioned, I may be wrong, you briefly mentioned McClellan, and we're going to now show a few clips of McClellan speaking in a quite impassioned way on the subject of shunning.
I think the real issue is that for some people, the circumstances will be such that they just can't stay, and they will find it necessary for their own survival, effectively, to disassociate. But the consequence of that is they are shunned and lose all of their prior social structure. That's the issue. And you heard the evidence that some people gave about that issue. That's the problem.
If I could, Your Honour, with respect...
That doesn't happen in other parts of society, generally, to you. But the consequence of dissociation, as we understand it, is that person will be shunned, and that means they lose contact with family, friends, and everyone else who remains inside the Jehovah's Witness organisation. Is that right?
Again, Your Honour, the person...
Your colleague is nodding. Is that right or not?
Well, because you've said disassociated, Your Honour, but he or she can choose to be no longer an active member of the congregation.
I understand that, but if they are so unable to cope with what's happened and the way they've been treated inside the organisation, that they dissociate, then they lose all of their previous social structure. Is that right?
That could be the case, and we respect their right to make that decision.
Well, it's a pretty cruel way of dealing with someone, isn't it, who has suffered sexual abuse.
I could only repeat what I've said, Your Honour.
I know, but it's cruel, isn't it? To take away, by reason of the rules that you impose, all of their social structure. That's cruel. I understand what you say, but can I just ask you this simple question? Why is it necessary, when someone feels that they can no longer abide the organisation and has to dissociate, why is it necessary to shun them? why can't they keep having social contact with those people who happen to remain in the organisation?
Well, I'd say again, we're going to appear very repetitive. I apologise, Your Honour, but the individual can choose.
Why is it necessary for the organisation to tell all of its adherents, you must shun that person?
So some really heartfelt appeals to O'Brien and Spinks about shunning and how cruel it is. Was this kind of palpable in the room, Paul, when he was kind of trying to reach out to them? How earnestly he wanted them to see sense on this?
Yes, this was really the most frustrating part of the proceedings, because Justice McClellan had an extremely important point, and you could see that he was very, very passionate about it. And to see how Spinks was trying to get out of admitting that it's an issue and saying that the person doesn't have to shun, it's their choice. And so the victim who is disassociated is choosing to shun the congregation, and that really got lots of groans, etc., from within the audience. And also you could see the absolute frustration on McClellan's face there, that they were trying to wiggle out of it, accepting any responsibility for the damage this does. And that is why I made the point of going up to Angus at the end to just say it's not only disassociation that affects this, it's also the child then going on to lead a very self-destructive life afterwards. They're often in need of a great emotional support. They do turn to alcohol and drugs, etc., and then they get disfellowshipped as well. So the shunning comes from multiple angles, and then on top of that, even if you try to fade, once you're faded, you are still bad association, so you still will be shunned, not as strictly as if you disassociate or disfellowship, but even someone who fades will still be shunned. And O'Brien absolutely lied about that. That's when he was saying it is possible to walk away from the religion without consequence if you choose to just fade, which again, you everyone knows that if you fade from religion,
to keep your mouth shut.
Will have... Yeah, you have to keep your mouth shut.
Yeah.
You can't get caught doing anything the religion doesn't agree with. But the fact of just not being regular at meetings means that you will have no association within the religion anyway.
I guess, Covert, that regardless of what does or does not come from this commission in terms of changes to the organisation, I don't know how you feel, but I'm personally glad to at least see people like Justice McClellan getting it and trying to reach through that kind of impenetrable barrier of zeal, really, that the Watchtower representatives were putting up.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this was one of the absolute highlight moments of this particular case study, because you have Justice McClellan boils it down to a simple point: this is cruel. No one else does this. Nowhere else in society does this happen. Why do you do this? This is cruel. And you see them trying to wriggle out of it. I mean, I'm sat there, I'm saying, well, I mean, Angus Stewart, I'm sat there saying it's because they think the Bible tells them they have to do it. But it's amazing that Spinks can't bring himself to say that. And in the end, Angus Stewart says, well, you haven't answered the question, but the reason is you do it because you think the Bible tells you to. And then Brian sort of gives this kind of, well, yes, that's right, sort of answer. But to me, this is going back to what I think is very effective in dealing with harmful cults, is publicizing what they really do. If you look at Scientology, one of the reasons that the cult of Scientology is dying on its feet and is a dead cult walking is because the general public is now aware of how abusive and cruel it is. And I think the more we see this kind of publication, the more we see the general public become aware, and it enters into the cultural sphere that Jehovah's Witnesses perform this cruel act of shunning, it will make the brand toxic, the way that Scientology has become toxic. And it's also, I'm sure there's an incredible visceral vindication for everybody who is being shunned or is at risk of being shunned, to have Justice McClellan basically put it to them point blank: this is cruel, why on earth do you do it? Emotionally was, I think, very vindicating for a lot of people, because we go our entire lives being told by Watchtower that shunning's a loving provision, and to hear someone who has real authority and experience, i.e., a judge, tell the Watchtower, no, this is cruel, was a very significant moment.
Indeed.
Yeah, I do like the point that he made as well, where he's when they're trying to say, look, that this person's disassociated, they're shunning us, they don't want to deal with us anymore with the Christian congregation. Justice McClellan brought out that's totally untrue. They don't want to be associated with the religion as such, but they still want to have association with their family.
Yeah,
I think
that was
everyone
good.
gets that point, that shunning of family is completely different than religion. There should be no correlationship between whether you don't want to be part of a religion and whether your family can still talk to you or not.
Yeah, it was very satisfying when he made that distinction because, you know, I obviously disassociated and, you know, speaking for myself, I would happily have a relationship with everybody that I knew and cared about who were Jehovah's Witnesses, even if it meant never talking about religion. I just turned my back on the organisation. That's all it is. But that was not even countenanced by the testimony that was given by Spinks and O'Brien.
I mean, now that I've left, I have friends that are atheists. I have friends at work that are Muslims, that are Hindu, that are Christian. I would quite happily have my friends who are Jehovah's Witnesses. And like you say, even if I never talk to them about religion, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a reminder for anybody that's watching who may be not familiar with Jehovah's Witnesses that Jehovah's Witnesses' entire social structure is tied to the religion, and you cannot separate the two. And this is why Judge McClellan said that it's extremely cruel to take away the social structure of a person's life, which may be all of their friends. And many of us who were Jehovah's Witnesses had no other friends outside of the organization, even in a work circumstance. Many people work in an insular work circumstance where they might work with other Jehovah's Witnesses. So you've lost, aside from the checkout girl at the supermarket, you've lost all of your, you've lost all of your social connections. And I think he understands very well just how damaging that is to persons who have faded or disassociated or been disfellowshipped.
Indeed.
Yeah, you can imagine the effect this has on people that have been abused. That they've had adults, take advantage of them, and so they lose trust in that. And then when their parents also turn on them after that, then the emotional damage from this is very terrible and traumatic.
Yeah, they don't take into account the fact that a person who's been damaged by sexual and physical abuse may not want to be part of this organization anymore, but the organization says, well, that's your problem. You're spiritually weak. You're not a spiritual person. You've left the organization. You have shunned us. You have shunned the congregation. And you're gone, and you lose all your social structure as a result of that. And I think, again, that's what the commission and Counselor Stewart and Justice McClellan made it very clear that it's simply not fair. You can't put that on a sexual abuse victim. They've already gone through too much to lose all of their social contacts.
And the other point too is that they don't. It's not just this situation where a person disassociates. The elders actively follow people, look at, and try and get them disfellowship. For me, I hadn't been to a meeting for 6 months. I had an anonymous website, didn't even have my name on it, and they actively came after me after 6 months of not being a witness and disfellowshipped me. And one of the other people that I spoke to at the Royal Commission there, he had stopped going and become a Christian and just started going to another religion, so he just faded out. And they came after him and they went, well, you have disassociated yourself by your actions by going to another religion. So they don't just allow people to fade, they actively pursue them to formalise their disassociation or disfellowshipping.
Which is actually something that Angus Stewart brought out in Case Study 29 when he gave the example of celebrating Christmas. If you've got a Christmas tree in your front window and you're supposed to be a Jehovah's Witness, you're sending out a big loud signal that you no longer want to be a Jehovah's Witness, that you're disassociating. I guess just to kind of move things along a little bit, I think it's fair to say that the whole conversation about shunning was probably the most, or at least it looked this way on the video, it looked like the shunning discussion was the most intense of the whole proceedings. And it just did feel a little bit like the pressure might have got to Angus at one point, because there's a point where he says something that isn't factually correct. Just take a look at this clip.
The simple point is, and I'll let you respond, but I'm not going to go down this path we went down it before. The simple point is this: a person who does not want to be active in the organisation anymore, in order to avoid being shunned, must disassociate. There isn't a category of membership of inactive and nevertheless welcome.
Sorry, Mr. Stewart, that's...
I know you disagree. That's fine.
When we've put it in print, I mean...
So it could be that I am misreading this, but it seemed to me at least that the pressure might have been getting to Angus Stewart a little bit when he said there isn't a category of membership of inactive and nevertheless welcome. And Spinks' response was, well, we have it in print. Am I misreading this? Did he, what were your thoughts on it, Paul?
I think that the point that Mr. Stewart was making is valid, that if you're inactive, then you are not going to be welcome or actively associated with the congregation. They're not supposed to invite you out. They're not supposed to socialise with you. You are bad association. It's possible that people who are inactive do come along. So I guess the witnesses could have argued that this wasn't totally accurate. But you could see that Angus Stewart was extremely frustrated by this point. He just previous to that statement, he'd said, "Just answer the question, Mr. Spinks."
Yeah.
And then he jumped in and he said, you know, the reason is that because you believe it's unscriptural. And then when Spinks went to contradict him about this thing about still being welcome if you're inactive, he just jumps in, cuts him off and says, "I know you disagree, that's fine," and moves on. So by this stage, Angus Stewart really was just getting to the end of his patience as to how much he could deal with them sort of beating around the bush.
There was palpable frustration by this stage, and you had McClellan saying, "Mr. Stewart, I don't think we will get anywhere. I think we should move on." I guess
there's laughter on the video actually. That
yeah, there's a real kind
of
bemusement. You know, you can sense the bemusement in the room. But I'm just trying to put myself in the shoes of Rodney Spinks. You know, super smug kind of Watchtower defender. Who is kind of wanting to leap on anything that could be deemed as untruthful or apostate lies.
Well, I think this goes to the duplicity of the organization. You got to remember that they have two explanations for every term. So when you say the term welcome, that when he says inactive and nevertheless welcome, you can answer that two different ways. You can say, well, a Jehovah's Witness elder might say, well, of course they're welcome. If they're inactive, they're welcome to come to the meetings. They're welcome to...
We've even made a brochure welcoming them back to Jehovah's organization. That's how they will be thinking. Yeah.
They're going to for public relations purposes, they're going to say, of course the inactive are welcome. They can come and listen to the public talk, the Watchtower study. But the reality is we know that they are not welcome in social circles, because when a person is inactive, first of all, there's a piece of paper that proves you're inactive. After 6 months of not turning in field service, you're no longer just irregular, but you are inactive. That's an official term. So you don't turn in field service anymore. The friends, as we call them in the organization, are not going to be inviting you out to dinner. They're not going to be socializing with you. They're going to be under intense pressure not to go on ski trips with you, not to go on nights out with the guys, not to go on vacations, because you're not a spiritually minded individual. So from the standpoint of socially speaking, you're absolutely not welcome. From the standpoint of coming to the meetings and reactivating yourself and going to the public talk, then they're going to say, for official purposes, oh, sure, you're absolutely welcome. So it's very duplicitous.
I guess the phrase I was almost screaming into my computer screen at that point. I was almost trying to telepathically let Angus know of the phrase bad association. That's what it boils down to. If you are an inactive one, you are classed as bad association and preemptively shunned. That's kind of what I would have really loved if I could have just communicated with Angus at that precise moment. What he needed was the language, and the language he chose, if you're in Rodney Spinks' shoes, he would have just been thinking, well, of course the inactive are welcome. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we'll move on to our next point, which is where Rodney Spinks and Terrence O'Brien were asked about their participation in a redress scheme.
We agree to
going on to
disagree.
the question of redress, you don't actually have a policy with regard to how to handle claims that are brought against the organisational claims made, not necessarily in a court, but someone says, look, I was abused in the organisation one way or another. I want compensation for this. I want it to be dealt with. You don't have a policy that deals with that, do you?
We're certainly in the process of developing that, particularly since the release of the paper on redress from the Royal Commission. We've studied that and we're basically in agreement with many of the proposals in there. We don't take the view that we're waiting just until we hear the final thing, but there still are a number of questions that it seems to have to be resolved.
And that's this 2015 Royal Commission report on redress and civil litigation that you're referring to, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so that's been around for a couple of years now, but in short, you're saying you're working on a policy which we can expect at some stage?
Well, it's only in recent months we have had one request some time ago, probably more than a year ago, that we corresponded back with, and the claimant changed the solicitors they were using. So it's only just in the last, this week, the last few days, that we've received a report back from the legal firm that we've been using to deal with the requests that have come in.
Well, never mind individual cases. Can I just understand this from you? Is it the case that you're working on a redress policy and one can expect to see one in due course?
Yes, definitely.
Thank you.
So it's a little bit unclear or fuzzy as to precisely where Watchtower stands on the redress scheme. It does certainly seem as though they are willing to get involved, but on the other hand, there doesn't seem to be a great deal of action taken thus far in getting things off the ground. Would that be fair, Paul?
Yeah, so I think they mentioned that they've looked at the redress scheme, but they didn't commit to anything specifically. They haven't really come up with any solution either. I'm not sure legally whether a redress scheme would have to be something that they have to participate in, or whether it's something that they choose to participate in. But already in that discussion there, Terry O'Brien was saying how he was concerned that it may be unfair due to the size of the Watchtower organisation, etc. To which McClellan said, no, you don't have to worry about that side of things. So I really feel that they were floundering around here and trying to say that they might participate, but they've done nothing proactive about this. So I didn't really see this as being anything that was particularly promising. And then they mentioned, when it was brought up, well, are you assisting for your these victims to take them to get counselling? Have you paid for that? Are you engaging in that? Are you proactively doing anything? Then O'Brien had to admit that they haven't actually done anything yet. And I don't even know how that would work, because there's no way that the elders are going to start recommending a Jehovah's Witness go to some worldly therapist, and there's not enough Jehovah's Witness therapists to sort of go around. So I think it's going to be very difficult to get them to set up a scheme where they commit to spending money and sending the victims across for proper counselling.
I think the other potential issue, and maybe people can correct me if I'm wrong, because the national redress scheme would also include other religions, and my understanding is that the witnesses may actually have a scriptural objection to being involved in a scheme with other religions or contributing toward this. The impression I got from the waffling I got, and this is me theorizing, I think it's partly because they're terrified of paying out any money at all because they don't want to use funds for anything like that. But I think also they may have a hesitancy about being in the same scheme as the Roman Catholic Church or any other religion they would consider false, in the same way they don't participate in anything interfaith. This is me reaching a little bit, and maybe I don't know if anyone think that's a good theory or not, but I think there's actually a lot of the time where I've found with the commission, the witnesses will put up objections to hide the fact they really have a scriptural objection. Sometimes they have to do it, like the two-witness rule, but other times I think this is an occasion where they're being a bit slippery and they don't want to admit it's really because it's a scriptural objection as well as a financial one. That's my theory. I don't know how much it holds water, but that was my take on it.
I think the important thing to remember here is that we have O'Brien and Spinks under oath, and all of the statements that they made were taken on the Silver Bible. And the last part of this segment, Angus Stewart put it to them. He said, "Can I understand this from you? Is it the case that you are working on a redress policy and one can expect to see one in due course?" Mr. O'Brien said, "Yes, definitely." So we have them on record under oath saying yes, definitely. So if they don't participate in a redress program or scheme, first of all, the negative publicity around the organization is so severe right now, even in Australia since 2013, 2015, and now 2017, that they would be really taken to task for not participating in this. And the reality is that if they don't do it, their publicity is only going to get worse. And what's going to happen is they're going to end up paying anyway, because the redress scheme is going to take the form of civil lawsuits against the organization. And it really would be better for them in the long run to participate in the scheme, because they're going to lose the money anyway in the civil cases, which are happening in the United States and are certainly now in the process of taking place in Australia.
With this redress scheme, it didn't really discuss what sort of financial amounts we're talking about here, and Terry O'Brien didn't seem to know either what the effect was going to be. So he seemed concerned as to what the total overall cost could be. Just looking at the financial report, they only get in Australia $18 million. This is in 2011. They got $18 million total income. And they have $14 million worth of expenses that they're committed to, which is only a few $1 billion left over. So if this is going to add up to a potential of millions a year, then it would just cripple the organisation. So I think until they sort of know financially what the effect is going to be, there'd be great concerns about how this is going to affect them financially.
Covert, did you have something to add?
Just on that point, the Royal Commission have actually announced how much they're recommending. Now, the difference is whether or not that gets taken up by the government. The Commission have recommended a maximum of £160,000 per case, and it will slide depending on how much the negligence of the organisation contributed to the suffering. Now, assuming that the government accept that and say £160,000 per case, I would argue it's almost certain that almost every single person claiming under the Watchtower scheme will get £160,000 or dollars because of how negligent and crazy the policies are. Now, if you've got 1,000 victims, let's say 500 of them claim, and then you get extra one a year due to these ongoing policies, you can see how this could potentially rack up to be a huge bill that Watchtower will not want to pay. So bearing in mind everything you've said, Paul, about what their operating expenses are, I think, although it didn't get touched on in terms of time in this testimony, I think this is something that Watchtower is genuinely very worried about, because they've got a huge number of victims that will probably, if they claim, will probably all get the maximum payout. And then if they keep the policies in place, they'll keep having victims go through this same policy every year. So I think for me, I think financially, this is something that Watchtower is really worried about. And that's why they're trying to get out of it, as you say, so much.
Yeah, I think I assume you meant $160,000, not pounds.
Yeah, sorry, $160,000. That's my latent colonialism showing. I do apologise.
Showing which country you're based in. But I think they, if the going forward, 160,000 is not a huge amount for one or two cases a year going forward. But if they have to collectively pay back, up to 1,000 victims, then that would just completely cripple the organisation.
By the way, I've switched cameras now because the camera I was recording on before has run out of memory. So I'm now on my laptop camera, just in case viewers are confused as to why I'm being seen from a different angle. So just to explain that. Technical difficulties, but we will overcome them. as we move on to the next point. Now, we touched on this before. I'm just going to show you now a few clips from the hearing related to the mysterious child safeguarding document.
So you anticipate then finalising it shortly, would that be right, in the next week or two?
That's correct.
Yes. And then to whom is it going to be published exactly?
To congregation members.
To all congregation members.
So that's the audience for this document, is all congregation members.
How will that be done?
Well, that's the decision the branch committee has got to make, whether we're going to do that in a printed form or whether it's going to be distributed through electronically through the electronic mailing system for each congregation and made available locally. That's either way, it's available to all congregation members.
But you give the undertaking now that rephrase it, the undertaking now that the intention is that it be distributed to all congregation members.
Yes,
that's the audience for this document, and sorry, Mr.
Yeah, I can speak on behalf of the branch committee on that, who are authorised to make that available, that it will be available to every member of every congregation in Australia.
Well, making it available may be something different to what I'm speaking about, because making it available could be if someone asks for it, they can have it. I'm just seeking to determine whether it's actually going to be actively distributed so that people have access to it without having to ask for it.
So if I could, I'm not a part of the branch committee, but the recommendation that we've made, and I believe will be acceptable, that every congregation member will have it made available to them, whether that's through a paper distribution or an announcement or made available at the Kingdom Hall. That's the only decision that's got to be made. But every congregation member will be made aware of it and a copy made available to them.
So I spoke about this a little bit earlier, and my concerns with the safeguarding document are not just the fact that it's not really a policy document, it's just something that's being produced for the sake of producing it, but there's also the point that was made by Angus Stewart Covert that the issue of distribution. It's one thing saying that you're going to make a document available, it's another thing entirely to actually distribute it and put it in the hands of ordinary witnesses.
Yeah, and as we've seen before, it would be entirely consistent with Watchtower's mentality to create this document but never tell anyone that it exists, and then just claim, well, if people request it, they can have it, but then no one knows it exists and no one ever requests it. This was clearly a concern for the Commission as well, and Angus Stewart, he actually takes the time to drill down on it, and they're sort of saying it's going to be available, and he says that, Spinks says that's correct, and Stewart's like, who, to whom is it going to be published? And how will this be done? And do you give the undertaking that this is to be distributed amongst congregation members? And he actually he drills down and gets them to confirm that it will be. It's not just going to be a case this document exists and you can ask for it if you want to. What Spinks and O'Brien commit to in their testimony is that this will be handed out to the congregation members in some form. Now, granted, this is the thing. There is ambiguity here, and we've seen Spinks and O'Brien outright lie already. I suppose the one good thing is that here they're saying it in testimony, and as John has said, they swore on the Bible. So I'm not convinced they'll do it, but if they don't, at the very least they can be proven to have lied and deceived the Commission. It's going to be very interesting going forward to see if this does get released in Australian congregations and to what extent.
Paul, have you by any chance managed to see this document, and do you expect it to change things for Australian witnesses?
No, I haven't seen the document, and I'm not quite sure either how they would distribute it. But yeah, as has been mentioned, they generally like to keep these things amongst the elders, not to be out there for public distribution. So I can't imagine it getting a very prominent airing in front of the whole congregation.
Indeed. I think it's just going to be a case of the similar situation to the UK safeguarding document, where if you know about it, you can ask about it. But we know, because we've been Jehovah's Witnesses, that if you walk up to your elders and say, I'd like to see the child safeguarding document, please, you're instantly flagging yourself as someone who might be a troublemaker when it comes to child molestation.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me of the document that they make available to those who are going through child custody cases, right? They make that very clear that this is available, but it's upon special request that anyone going through a JW child custody case, such as a witness wife and a non-witness husband, then this document is available to them, but it's extremely difficult to get it. You have to go through the coordinator of the body of elders. You have to be approved to have this document. And I as you guys have said, I really don't see them being forthright with this document, even though Spinks under oath stated that it will be available to all congregation members. But that's a very broad statement, and I don't think we're going to see them handing them out at the Christian Life and Ministry meeting by any means.
I don't see that at all, no.
It's going to be a new Caleb and Sophia video. It's going to be very, very scary.
So just at the end of the proceedings, there was an interesting little exchange featuring Commissioner Murray. I'm going to show you a clip.
I want to know, in terms of your response to the 1,006 files of victims and subsequent victims that have come to your attention, whether the Jehovah's Witnesses branch in Australia have assisted or decided to assist or planned to assist victims or survivors with respect to therapeutic intervention by independent experts.
Yes, so on that, Commissioner, we, of course, allow the individual to decide who they would like to use, but certainly we will assist in funding any of the victims who fall into that category automatically under the terms of reference of the Redress scheme.
Well, this is not really about the law. It's about going further than compassion and actually providing people help for grievous psychological harm. Surely you're not going to wait until 2018 when a redress scheme finally comes up to reach out to victims and survivors?
No, not at all, Commissioner, because we have already now been in contact with these. So the ones who've made claims, we're not actively going out looking for other victims because we don't know what the situation is with them. But those who've corresponded to us, who've sought some form of redress or compensation, we're at the point now where we can address it long before 2018.
Well, perhaps I could ask through you, Mr. Stewart, perhaps I could ask through you if you could give us some formal advice as to whether you are assisting anyone at present with financial help for independent therapeutic advice as a branch.
We'll follow that up, Commissioner.
So this was quite an interesting point here. There was some real concern about the fact that there was so little humanity being shown by Watchtower in refusing to offer therapeutic intervention to those who'd survived child molestation. You almost sense a little bit of naivety there, perhaps from the Commissioner, or do you think, Paul, he really did expect Watchtower to have offered cash to victims of child abuse?
I do think that he would have expected that they could offer a little bit of cash, particularly to help them go out and get counselling. And I don't think he actually realised that counselling is quite so looked down upon within the Watchtower community as well. So the idea of a Jehovah's Witness victim going and talking to a counsellor about what's happened is something that we definitely frowned upon by the elders, because they know that the counsellor will quite often relate back to this child's issues, the religion, as part of that abusive structure. So I don't see that they will be forthcoming in this, and Justice McClellan wouldn't have understood that. I do know there are some in Australia, some actual Jehovah's Witness counsellors that do very good trade amongst the witness community. But
I can imagine.
certainly not, there's not enough of them to cover all the cases required.
I think that's a case of demand outstripping supply, really. So
this was the case with Stephanie Fessler, was that she was first introduced to a counselor who was one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and then it came up later in court about her counseling, and the elders actually, in one of their letters, declared that they were very much, they told witnesses to be very cautious about any sort of group counseling, even though one-on-one counseling was technically acceptable. They don't want anyone coming into a spiritually compromising situation by engaging in group counseling. So I think we're going to see, whenever this happens, the date of 2018 was mentioned by, I believe, Commissioner Murray. So I think we're going to see more clarification of what exactly they expect in terms of either independent group counseling or one-on-one counseling.
You can actually get a glimpse of what Watchtower's real attitude is toward this, because O'Brien lets it slip, because the commission asks, he sort of says, surely you're not going to wait until 2018, well, what are you doing now? And O'Brien says, well, we've already been in contact with the ones who have made claims. We're not actively going out to look for other victims because we don't know what their situation is. So in other words, rather than putting an announcement out through the congregations, if you've been abused and you'd like counselling, we have cash we can help you with, please come. And they've been just completely, we're not looking for anyone. Maybe if someone pops up and asks, we might help them, but we're not going to proactively do anything with this. I think that gives you a little insight into what Watchtower's attitude is going to be with this. It doesn't come as any great surprise, I must admit, but it's interesting to see O'Brien let it slip under questioning.
Well, there's been a massive insight, I think we can all agree, into a lot of aspects of Watchtower's governance. I think that's all we have time for in terms of our point-by-point discussion, but I did want to just take a few moments to just see what we're going to do with this information moving forward. I mean, Paul, you have a fantastic resource that lists different subjects kind of almost encyclopedically. Are you kind of trying your best to keep your child abuse page up to date with what's been happening at the Royal Commission?
Yeah, I've been working on a new article just to do a summary of the child abuse case. So I wanted to sort of wait till everything comes out and then do it as a single article going through chronologically what happened, what the outcomes were, and then eventually I'll update that with what if the Watchtower actually does anything to comply. So I think that's very interesting. It is hard to keep up with this because there's been so many changes over the years. But then again, it hasn't been that they haven't moved that quickly at addressing anything that the commission has come out with at this stage, which is quite a surprise.
I was going to say, in one way it's fast moving, but in another way it's painfully slow moving, at least in terms of Watchtower actually doing anything meaningful about it. Covert, as far as JW Survey is concerned, what can you tell us about how we're going to be dealing with the material coming out of the Royal Commission in terms of this case study and future material?
Well, we've got a number of articles planned to cover sort of certain aspects of what was revealed in this case study. We're planning to do a number of articles dealing with different aspects of it because there's so much that came out of it. We're going to keep covering it. There's obviously the final report that will come out of this case study as well. And the thing with the Royal Commission is it's kind of, without wanting to sound too trivial, it's the gift that keeps on giving. Anytime you want to refer back in an article to the examples of Watchtower behaving badly, the Royal Commission is full of it. So you can expect in the near future there will be a number of articles specifically dealing with the Commission, but we're also going to be referencing it in a more general way, really, when it comes to dealing with how the governing body behaves, how Watchtower behaves, how trustworthy they are. It's kind of a goldmine of information.
Indeed. I know, John, viewers probably don't know how things work in terms of emails at JW Survey. We do have an email address. And John, would it be right in saying that there's been a great deal of interest from JW Survey readers through the email at what's been happening in Australia?
I'd like to say that I want to thank everyone who's contacted JW Survey, because I didn't expect the response that we've had over the past even several months. With the Stephanie Fessler article, we had 14,000 views in less than a day. following the settlement of that case. But not only did we have views, more importantly, we had multiple people reaching out to us, it seems every other day now, who have either been victims of child abuse or have been shunned, or have family members who were Jehovah's Witnesses who were affected by child abuse. And I just want to thank everyone for their patience in allowing us time to get back to their emails, to help direct them to the right resources, whether that be counseling, whether that be an attorney that might be able to help them with their case. And, want to tell everyone that we really want to help them. And also to any Jehovah's Witnesses listening, we want them to understand that these are not the stereotypical apostate-driven lies or conspiracies or the things that Watchtower wants the public to believe. As I mentioned earlier, Vincent Toole said that these are apostate-driven commissions, and that they believe Satan is behind it. I personally wrote to one of the United States Branch Committee members during the 2015 commission, and he said that Satan was like a roaring lion. And he said, when the lion roars, don't run. In other words, don't run away from these accusations, but stand up to them. The problem is that the organization has been standing up to these accusations, and they're losing tens of millions of dollars in settlements.
Jehovah is our judge. Jehovah is our king.
Yeah, and unfortunately,
he better be a
Jehovah's
banker as well, otherwise you're going broke.
It's sad that he's not protecting them, and eventually the patience of individual witnesses are going to run out. So our job at JW Survey is to present objective information, factual information, and we even have a statement on our website that if anyone finds something that they feel is inaccurate, please let us know. Send us an email, and we will correct it. And I'm sure that I could speak for Paul that he has the same policy on JW Facts, that any piece of information that's incomplete, inaccurate, he'll get it corrected right away. So I want to thank everybody for contacting us.
Gentlemen, all that remains is for me to thank all of you for your insights on the Royal Commission. It's been, I'm hoping that everything works when I piece it all together in the editing stage, but I can only thank again Paul for joining us all the way from Australia, and again, without wanting to descend into too much of a fanboy, thanking you for your role really in my awakening and for the work that you continue to do. Thank you so much.
Mine too, actually, Paul.
Yeah.
While you're on the line, JW Facts was basically, there's two websites that are the reason that I'm out: JW Facts and JW Survey. So, Paul, I'm buying you a drink the next time I'm in Australia.
Thank you. I appreciate the comments.
Okay, so that's a goodbye from me, a goodbye from Paul, a goodbye from John over there in the United States, and a goodbye, I'm assuming, from Covert Fade.
Goodbye.
Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this video, everyone. Please look out for future episodes of Watchtower in Focus, and as always, thank you for watching.